Happy Monday, everyone. The InFAMOUS series has seen plenty of different powers over its trio of games and 2 expansions. Specifically, 7 different power sets have been playable across the series. But I think there's one that's just a titch better than the rest. Now, before we get into it, I want to address a few concerns. For starters, when powers are featured in more than one game, such as electricity being in InFAMOUS 1 and 2, and neon being in both InFAMOUS Second Son and First Light, we will discuss them in reference to their most developed appearance. That means when we discuss neon, we're talking about fetch, and when we discuss lightning, we're talking about InFAMOUS 2, though once again, we're not counting napalm and ice alongside lightning. This is because, 1, it doesn't make the video very interesting, because obviously lightning would win in that case. 2, you can't get ice and napalm in the same playthrough, which makes me want to split them up anyways. And 3, if we choose to combine powers like this, then it basically turns into a video about what's better, lightning or power copying, and that's not very fun. Finally, to address another concern, I know I'm all up in your business here, and the truth is, I saw this tweet and it pissed me off, and 2, it's a solid way of showing you that these videos are not AI generated and never will be in any capacity. And up, I see you, I know you're gonna make some kind of comment calling me bald, but before you do, please be original, okay? This comment, banger. This, a Mr. Clean joke in the Big 2-6, grow the fuck up, okay? Get real. Also, did you know that only 20% of you are subscribed? I'm just kidding, let's talk about InFAMOUS. You know we gotta start with the classic, okay? And shockingly, it's difficult to decide if I wanna mention InFAMOUS 1 or InFAMOUS 2's version of lightning. I think InFAMOUS 1 has some nice abilities, like the lightning strike being based on overall energy and not a separate resource. I think the shield is an invaluable ability, and while aesthetics aren't that big of a deal because Sucker Punch always delivers some gorgeous effects, the black lightning in the first game is so iconic, and I cannot fully express my disappointment that we don't see it in the sequel. Now, granted, it's a tad unrealistic, and even in that game, it leaned a bit more into looking like a comic book power, thus being unfit for InFAMOUS 2's more realistic art style, but still, come on! Unfortunately though, I think InFAMOUS 2 is just the better choice as we have almost every ability making a return in some way. Traversal that is much tighter, some added powers like kinesis and tornadoes, and I'm sorry, but few moments in the series live up to that one mission in the thunderstorm. With that said, let's talk about the strengths of lightning. Something I think many people can agree on is that when it comes to basically any power in the series, the aesthetics are top-notch, with some minor exceptions that we'll get into later. But let's talk about one of the most important things with powers in these games, which is fantasy fulfillment. I think a trap that the InFAMOUS games have always run a risk of falling into was making their powers too vague. Now, what I mean by that is basically, well, video. The video power we will talk about later is too vague, so when we hear being able to manipulate video, we don't really know what the fantasy of that is, though video does find an interesting way of solving that problem. When we hear that we can manipulate electricity, we get images of Palpatine, of shooting electricity out of our hands, of calling down thunderstorms, and electricity's strength is not just in delivering that fantasy, but in exceeding it too. Now, the reason I bring up electricity first, especially in InFAMOUS 2, is that Sucker Punch really felt like they pulled out all the stops, and arguably exceeded what was reasonably within the realm of manipulating electricity. Like, the first power you get in InFAMOUS 2 is kinesis. One of the last you get is a lightning tether. Is that stuff cool? Yes! And it's those things that influence how much of an obvious pick electricity is for being at bare minimum in the top 3 best powers. But with that said, I can understand why people think InFAMOUS 2 didn't do enough with electricity, especially given that halfway through the game, they just give up on introducing new electric powers and say, fuck it, take frost or napalm. Except I'm lying, and in reality, they didn't introduce new electric powers because instead, they let you find new ways to use the ones you already have. Every base power from the first game returns with not only more sauce and animations, I'm looking at you, Rockets, but we also get some variations of those abilities to choose from on the fly. Normal lightning bolt? Cool, love it, but maybe you want some more power. Try the Magnum Bolt, which gives a proper lightning arc like what we saw in InFAMOUS 1, and ensures that any headshot is going to do nutso damage. The sticky grenade genuinely makes grenades in general useful for me. I'll be honest, I think the grenade is a fine source of damage, but having it stick to people, or more importantly, bosses, shoots its utility through the roof. There are, of course, other things like the improved thrusters that are excellent, and I won't bother sticking on electricity too long. But before we move on, let's talk about one of the issues with electricity, and prepare yourself, this is gonna take a while. I think the only real issue I have with electricity is that, No, it's pretty good actually. I guess giving us a better lightning storm would be nice, and black lightning always would be appreciated, but otherwise I feel that lightning is a really great power aside from the obvious thing that's missing, which is speed. We all know the Infamous games run like hell on a good day, so I think the biggest thing that prevented Cole from moving faster is definitely due to hardware restrictions. I think if we're to see electricity again, there's a high likelihood we need some kind of fast movement like we've seen previously with Neon. So there it is. We've talked about some of the series' highs, but now it's time we come back to the ground, specifically to the concrete. What a fucking disappointment. I think having concrete in some way is better than not having it, don't get me wrong. And I don't think it's bad per se, but severely underdeveloped. This makes sense given that Second Son actually had a year of its development cycle cut down. But I also think that Concrete's lack of sauce is bigger than that, and it all starts with the fundamentals of Delson's abilities. We know Delson is a power sponge, but I think the way Delson is portrayed in this game is as someone who has a few basic skills and then gets different aesthetics for those skills instead of new powers. For example, he can use thrusters for every power, and they function somewhat differently. Concrete gives more lift than smoke, and Video has minor momentum effects, but the core ability is the same. It's more of a game design issue though, so I guess the result is the same, but either way, I think Concrete is a power that is a bit too vague, specifically because its applications are generally undefined. And when that's the case, it means the player could almost never be satisfied. We get to see Augustine level entire bridges and transform herself into Onyx mid-boss fight, and then when we get the power, we get a shrapnel stream, and we can turn into a concrete blob to achieve the same thing that Neon Dash does, but not even as good because it can't go up walls. Also, while we're on the topic of undefined powers, when we look at draining the concrete, we can only do so by draining it off of the DUP. I'm sorry, you need to absorb concrete, dog. Open your fucking eyes! I want to be able to absorb the concrete from the street, not off the same chuds I've been fighting the whole game. This is why vague powers are an issue. In Infamous 1 and 2, the game wasn't afraid to give you unlimited power during thunderstorms or when surrounded by electricity. And sure, we don't want to make the concrete too powerful for the sake of balance, but actually, yeah, why not? It's the post-game, and let's not pretend that the game was ever afraid of giving you 3 different ways to basically delete everything in a mile radius. Speaking of which, no karmic streak ability. Man, this isn't even a swing and a miss, it's walking away from the fucking plate. I'm done hating on concrete, so let's instead focus on some other underdeveloped powers like ice and napalm. I think both of these powers are cool, and I like to think that napalm specifically was in some ways a spiritual successor to smoke. But their biggest issue was just that they were side powers meant to be integrated into electricity. This means that if we split the powers into different categories, they are technically some of the weakest, but it doesn't sit right with me to call them bad, because they were never meant to be full-blown power sets. Just a bit of salt and pepper to spruce up the powers we already have, and by that metric, they work great. The Ice Shield offers good defense, which is convenient given how much certain enemies like to get in your face with a shotgun, and I hate them. The Ice Launch also gets you to the perfect height to grind rails, making that even easier too. So if I had to choose, I'd say that Ice is better than Napalm, strictly because I think Napalm acts more as an addition to your powers, whereas Ice is an extension. One is placed on top, the other is mixed in. Okay, now let's move back to dedicated power sets and look at Video. I've heard some say that Video was disappointing, and I agree, sort of. But I also think that Video mostly fulfills expectations given that it's such a vague power. Our first introduction to Video is through our boss fight against He Who Dwells. And when we get the power, we're expecting the ability to summon angels and demons and conjure classic fantasy constructs. I think this is fulfilled by the invisibility, the big sword, the wings when we fly around, and it fulfills a role in the game's balance. Without getting too far into it, the different powers have general strengths. Smoke focuses on crowd control, Neon is focused on precision and speed, and Video is focused on single target damage. There are hardly any AoE abilities with Video, and even its Hellfire Blades focus on one enemy, making it perfect for boss fights and mini-bosses. This is clearly seen when fighting Augustine. The first time we do it with Smoke and it's alright, but then we face off again with Video and we just fucking demolish the lady. Even the Karmic Shriek ability has a more narrow damage range than the others, so I think in that regard, Video works well as a general aggressive power. But the problem once again comes from the very narrow way of using those powers. Thrusters we've seen, melee we've seen, and is generally useless because without the cover mechanics of previous games, movement and spacing is your best defense. And the dash ability isn't exactly new either. I'll admit it's better than Neon because Neon is heavily carried by the lightspeed dash, and I certainly don't think the power is as bad as people say, but video is nowhere near getting the top spot for me. Now we can move on to my personal favorite power, and that is Smoke. I don't think it's the best power, but it's definitely my favorite, and it's one that I feel embodies the protagonist most. You know, Cole to me, for as much as I love him, never screamed Electric Man based on his appearance, and that goes doubly so for the second game. However, I think Second Son did a good job of having powers reflecting the person's personality, like Eugene, being a gamer and thus being able to summon demons from a video game. Delsin, however, is a delinquent. People call him that all the time. And I specifically see Delsin as embodying the juvenile rebellion of someone who doesn't really know their place in the world. This is embodied by his outfit, his graffiti, and of course, by his powers too. When we think of juvenile delinquency, one of the first things to come to my mind is smoking. 2 decades ago, it was cigarettes, now it's vapes and e-cigarettes, and there's always been something about smoking, about polluting your surroundings, breathing smog, that is so appealing to teenage rebellion. I think that's why Smoke works so well for Delsin, because it follows suit with his personality of being a bit of a rebel. I think that's why he goes for the denim vest too. It brings to mind images of bikers and outlaws. When it comes to actual powers, then I think Smoke does suffer from being the first power you get, because it sticks to the basics for much of the runtime. It remixes familiar powers from the first 2 games like grenades, thrusters, and classic pellets reminiscent of the bolts from Infamous 2, but because it's the first power you get, it also means that the powers you get after need to be better. So it does feel like Smoke never quite gets more than the jack-of-all-trades treatment. You want to go fast? You have Neon. You want to do damage? You have Video. Smoke is a good all-rounder and is by far the most Sucker Punch have shown off when it comes to visual effects, and it's a big reason why it's my favorite. It looks fantastic, and every animation is smooth as butter. The orbital drop is basically iconic for Delsin, and for as much as I labeled this as a jack-of-all-trades power, it does mean that you can really never go wrong with Smoke. Also, while traversal may not be as fast as the others, I also appreciate that it requires the most thought. Planning a route through the city by utilizing smoke vents and your limited dashes is a constant challenge that makes exploring the city much more fun than Neon, which basically blurs most of the environments in your peripheral. But okay, we got one power left here, and generally, I've talked somewhat negatively about it thus far, and it's Neon. But there's a catch. I'm not talking about Neon in Second Son, which I do think is great. I'm talking about Neon in Infamous First Light. Not as many people played this one due to it being a shorter spin-off. It did retcon quite a lot from Second Son, but it did also develop Neon as a power set much further. We get a much better karmic ability in the Neon Singularity, we get better melee that includes finishers, something only previously seen in Infamous 2, and we get boosted speed thanks to the neon gas bubbles around Seattle. There's even more, like the missiles being heat-seeking and air dashing being added as well. Instead of a stasis bubble, we get a much more versatile push ability, and when it comes to animations, no other game does it better than First Light. I have some issues with the powers though, and it's not even in the powers themselves, but the things surrounding those powers. For example, only having access to one half of Seattle is such a missed opportunity. Not having the same lighting choices from Second Son is also disappointing. And finally, not being able to change outfits in free roam is such a bummer because 1, that DUP Fetch outfit goes crazy, and 2, Fetch's default outfit has a belt around her shorts that actively bends and warps with her ass. That is not how belts work, and I'm sorry because I know I just ruined the game for you. While Seattle might be closed off, at least we get a few arenas to test our skills in, and I think this alone is a show of confidence from Sucker Punch. Like, they know they cooked crazy style with this one, so they're like, yeah, feel free to keep using it. We get the ability to make enemies and turrets fight for us, we get an entire post-game of upgrades, and we get speed like we haven't seen before. I think Neon is by far the most developed power set in the series, and it makes me sad that we never got a sequel to Second Son or another spin-off featuring Eugene or something. I think if we didn't have an Infamous 2, we would never consider Lightning to have its current GOAT status, and I think Neon is right up there with Electricity because it was given the chance to try again. Now, sure, Lightning did have Ice and Napalm to fall back on, but even still, it introduced new ways to use your powers and improved some of the stickiness from the first game. So with that said, I think the best power in the series is Neon. I think Electricity is a very, very close second, but they really just nailed everything they needed to with Neon. They fleshed out the moveset, fulfilled the fantasy of what we think using Neon would look like, they made the traversal both fast and fun, and the animation set was approached with a level of care and fluidity that I just don't think was possible on the PS3. I should also mention that my favorite power is Smoke, but these are just my thoughts on the powers based on how well I think they are done. I have so much nostalgia for Lightning and Smoke, so it's hard for me to say Neon is better, but simply based on my own criteria, I think it is. So tell me, what's your favorite power and why? Why do you think I'm so wrong? Feel free to let me know down below, and feel free to let me know what you think of this video style. Do you prefer the disembodied voice? Is it because my attractiveness is distracting? Don't be embarrassed, don't be ashamed, okay? It happens to a lot of people. And also, stop asking if I have cancer, okay? I'm just bald!